In this lecture, we're going to examine the rise of fascism in Europe in the period from 1920 to 1940 after World War I. On this particular slide, you'll see some of the major figures of the fascist movement that arose in Europe in the decades following the First World War. The end of the First World War brought significant geopolitical changes in Europe, including the end of the Russian, German, Austrian, and Ottoman empires. The German, Austrian, and Ottoman empires were carved up in part at the Treaty of Versailles, territories allotted to some of the new nations that you see listed below. The Russian Empire came to a close as a result of the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. Something known as the Lost Generation is a feature of the post-World War I European scene, where you had a significant number of Europeans who were very disenchanted with government, with society, some of whom had served in the war, perhaps even maimed in the war, and a very disillusioned lot. It affected art and literature as well as politics. And the emergence of the League of Nations came as a result of the First World War and the Treaty of Versailles. Pictured here are what we sometimes refer to as the Big Four, who really called the shots at the Treaty of Versailles: Great Britain, Italy, France, and the United States. And really, even though Vittorio Orlando from Italy was considered one of the leading figures, it really came down to Britain, France, and the United States, who really dictated the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. There was quite a bit of discord between the former allies from the First World War. Clemenceau and the French really wanted payback from the Germans because the Germans, in their opinion, had started the First World War invading France through Belgium. A little bit more moderate tone from Great Britain, and a little bit more idealistic tone from Woodrow Wilson in the United States, who was not a fan of harsh punishment of the Germans, but he did not win out. The treaty itself, Germany lost a great deal of important industrial and commercial and mining regions, including Alsace-Lorraine, which they had won from the French in the Franco-Prussian War of 1871, Saarland, Silesia, which is a big industrial and mining region, and the port of Danzig was given to Poland, the newly formed Polish nation, which was renamed Gdansk. In terms of the military, Germany was limited to a 100,000-man army without any tanks, artillery, or air force, and were only allowed a very small navy. Article 231, and again, these terms were really dictated to the Germans by the Allies, who were given an ultimatum: either sign the treaty as presented, or the invasion would commence of Germany. So the Germans were really in a difficult position. But it essentially said that Germany had to accept full responsibility for the First World War. And finally, a very high level of reparations the Germans were forced to pay, with an estimated payback into the 1980s. So if you can imagine being alive in 1919 in Germany and perhaps being 20, 30, or 40 years old, it's very difficult to imagine what the world would be even like 60 to 70 years down the road, and yet your nation would be paying reparations for that long. The League of Nations came as a result of the First World War. It was an attempt, precursor really to the United Nations, but an attempt to settle all disputes in peaceful means rather than warmongering. The countries that are in, that's rather a magenta-looking color, pinkish magenta, would be the ones who did not participate. You can see most significant was the United States, which did not ratify the Treaty of Versailles and agree to a joining of the League of Nations, which in my opinion was a fatal flaw of the League of Nations, not to get the world's largest democracy and the largest industrial base on board with the plan. The fascist movement thus emerged in a Europe that was recovering from the First World War, and which there was considerable political dissatisfaction, unrest, and even revolution in some places. We should briefly talk about what fascism is. It's a term that gets thrown around a lot by people of all political persuasions these days. We're quick to label those with whom we disagree as fascists. Fascists in general were anti-communist and anti-liberal, which sounds a little puzzling, but we're talking here about classical liberalism and free markets and representative democracy. And they saw both communism and Western liberalism to have been failed political experiments, this being fascist. They sought a different way that nations should be run. Typically, the most important thing to fascists is the survival of the state and individual liberties considerably restrained, including freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly. Most fascist movements have a great fear of foreign influence, of foreign invasion or contamination. That's a common theme throughout fascist movements. Most fascists look backward in time to a time they believe to have been a golden age for their particular nation or people. Most fascists are convinced there are efforts to destroy the nation that they're so proud of. Generally, fascists structure their political appeals not to the poor or rich, but to the middle classes. Typically, fascists view dissent as treason, and fascist movements are noted for their use of paramilitary groups to help keep order and to enforce the will of the party. Americans have a tendency to think of Adolf Hitler first when they think of the word fascism, but the first true fascist was really Benito Mussolini. His father was a socialist revolutionary, and in the early years of Mussolini's life, he too had a left-leaning political persuasion. There's stories of him as a rather rambunctious, even violent youth. In school, supposedly he stabbed a fellow classmate when he was a child. In his earlier years, he also worked briefly as a teacher. The mugshot that you see to the bottom left hand of the screen is actually from Switzerland, and he was arrested by the Swiss several times trying to foment socialist revolution. He got considerable experience as editing newspapers, working as a journalist. La Lotta di Classe was one of the first papers that he edited. At age 29, he became the editor of Italy's largest daily newspaper called Avanti, A-V-A-N-T-I. He was successful in generating interest. A little fight with other party members led him to start his own newspaper, Il Popolo d'Italia, the people of Italy. And the new paper began moving away from socialist ideals. Many socialists at the start of the First World War were very skeptical or outright hostile to the idea of war, and Mussolini embraced war. He saw it as a great moment for Italy to reclaim some of its lost glory. He was a strong supporter of the war, and it is during the war that his views move away from socialism and toward fascism. Here again is the mugshot of Benito Mussolini a little closer. Very handsome fellow. Here's Mussolini during the war, an image of him during the war. He was actually wounded at one point. He fought about 17, 18 months in the war. It took 40 grenade fragments at one point. So he was a decorated war veteran, and quite proud of that. He called it at one point the most beautiful moment of my life. After the war, the Italians felt that they had been kind of sold out by the Allies. They had hoped to gain more territory, what they called the irredentia, or unredeemed lands that had been part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The economy fell flat. There were a lot of people out of work. Certainly socialist, communist, and other left-leaning groups fomented labor unrest. The multifaceted, multi-party parliament system broke down, and there were significant fears throughout Italy that Italy was ripe for a communist revolution. And these were not unfounded, because the Bolshevik Revolution had recently occurred in Russia, which became the Soviet Union. There was a significant revolution, failed revolution though, in Berlin at this time. So this is not without some merit that there were these concerns. After the First World War, Benito Mussolini fully embraced the growing fascist movement, founded the PNF, the National Fascist Party, in 1921, and the real strength of his party were the Blackshirts. Camicie nere is the Italian term for black shirts, squadristi. These were armed, in some cases, thugs, some ex-criminals, some ex-military, some concerned citizens, but these were people who were not afraid to use their fists, sticks, or pistols in order to support the party, and quite intimidating. And one of the tactics they would use would be to bust in on rival parties and break up the political gatherings. And one of the main reasons that Mussolini came to power was the presence of the camicie nere. Mussolini's March on Rome is really more comic opera than a real revolution. It was composed of fewer than 30,000 men. Mussolini really didn't march the whole way himself. He showed up at a few places for photo ops, went ahead. His goal was to force the hand of the king to name him prime minister. He was elected to parliament with a very small support for his party, and the king called Mussolini's bluff, and rather than starting what he feared was a revolution, he figured he could name Mussolini as prime minister, perhaps co-opt him, and then settle the people down this way. And the king, I think, really feared a civil war more than anything else. At this time, too, it should be noted that fascism wasn't seen as much of a threat to the establishment as communism or socialism was. And there were many business leaders who looked, if not fondly, at least tolerantly, toward the camicie nere, or the black shirts, seeing them as useful in the fight against communism. Theoretically, the Italian political system was a constitutional monarchy. The king would name the prime minister, and the king had ultimate authority over the prime minister, could dismiss him at any time. There were two chambers of parliament that restricted the monarch's power, an appointive senate and an elective chamber of deputies. In theory, the cabinet ministers were solely responsible to the king, but in practice, though, without the support of Parliament, it was impossible for any Italian government to stay in office. So it was a chaotic time. And one of the running jokes at the time was that Italy changed parliaments more frequently than most other people changed t-shirts or undershirts. After being named prime minister, Mussolini worked quickly to consolidate his power. The squadristi, or camicie nere, were used in some cases to assassinate political rivals. We'll talk in a few slides in more detail about the unique and innovative use of propaganda by his fascist party. Significant repression of political opposition. Mussolini also had an interesting quote about his choice of ministers and cabinet ministers. He said that if he had the chance to appoint a good man or the chance to appoint a scoundrel, he would always appoint the scoundrel, because a scoundrel could be blackmailed and controlled. And there was significant corruption among Mussolini's advisors, and yet he allowed this to happen because this was one way to keep his political rivals in check, was to make sure that there was always some dirt that could be held against him. The squadristi kind of overreached at one point and assassinated one of the leading opposition politicians, Giacomo Matteotti. And this was this is very difficult for Mussolini to try to sweep under the rug. Imagine in an election year where a political rival who could be president were to become assassinated. This is not the kind of thing you can sort of pretend doesn't happen, even at a time that's not in the instantaneous news cycle that we are in these days. Mussolini probably was aware of what was happening. I don't think that he orchestrated necessarily the assassination. They did make an effort to, they had to throw someone under the bus or try someone, but only one fascist operative went to jail with regard to the killing, and it was a very short jail term as well. But again, this was a very significant PR debacle for Mussolini, and even industrialists were concerned that he couldn't rein in his own camicie nere. One of the ways that Mussolini helped cement his hold on power was through the innovative use of propaganda, and he was particularly concerned about his image. Frequently he would be depicted in ways that made him look very powerful. So in this particular images you can see Mussolini on horseback. This accomplishes two things, in part because he's rather short. He was only about 5'5", so this compensates for the fact that he's a little shorter than average. There's also a tried and true sort of military demeanor associated with a leader on horseback. If you think back to, for example, Napoleon, this was very clear to Mussolini, a very potent image that could be used. In this particular image, you can see, this didn't come out until after the Second World War, you can see how advanced Mussolini and his propagandists were at editing photos. We kind of take this for granted with Photoshop and some of the other tools that are available to manipulate images. But the picture on the left is the retouched photo that was released to the press, and on the right you can see Mussolini wasn't as full of bravado as he'd like to get people to believe, because there was a horse handler there. He knew how to ride a horse, but he certainly wasn't a skilled equestrian. In this particular still image, this is from a video that, if you're interested, you can look up on YouTube. Mussolini, in front of the reporters, took off his shirt. He was a rather muscular guy, in pretty good shape, and went to help with the harvest one day. Interestingly, Vladimir Putin, almost mirror image, used this same tactic about a year ago, so 2011, running into the 2012 election campaign that he was facing, of taking off his shirt and helping with a harvest. So he was very much using a page out of Mussolini's playbook. In this particular still image, Mussolini was wrestling a lion. It was actually a lion cub, and it had been doped up, but it still made good propaganda. Here we see Mussolini on skis, again shirtless. This is a calculated move, but he's trying to look as fit as possible. Interestingly, even though World War II had started, and we'll get to Italy's role in the war later in the course, as late as 1940, Mussolini was still pretty effective in getting good press from Western news agencies. Here you see him on the cover of Newsweek, Il Duce, the key man of the Mediterranean. So he was still seen as perhaps a force that could keep Hitler in check as late as 1940. In terms of politics, one of the ways that Mussolini's power base was strengthened was something known as the Acerbo Law. So the leading party had to have at least 25% of the vote, and by doing so, that party would get 2/3 of the seats in Parliament. So if you can imagine, by comparison, the 535 seats in the American Senate and House, all a party would need to do is get 1/4 of the vote to get 2/3 of that, and then they would always have a veto-proof majority, and then the rest would be split among the other parties. This, of course, is essentially turning Italy into a one-party state from this point forward. Mussolini made what had been a de facto one-party rule official in 1925 by unilaterally abolishing all other parties. The PNF-dominated legislature simply voted all of the other parties out of existence. Interestingly, you had to have a PNF card to get any decent job, and with the squadristi attacking any opposition meetings, you had both a legal barrier to any other parties as well as an on-the-street practical thug-based attacks to all opposition. Mussolini, in terms of the economy, embraced a philosophy that he called state corporatism. This was supported by small capitalists, low-level bureaucrats, and the middle class. All of these groups were fearful of the rise of socialism. In theory, this was a way to kind of manage the economy. In practice, though, state corporatism didn't quite work out the way Mussolini envisioned. We should also add Mussolini's philosophies were not very entrenched. He was not a true ideologue, even though he was the first fascist. His first and foremost political philosophy was his own power and aggrandizement of power. In terms of the effects to the economy, the goal was to balance the interest of workers and business and the state by ending class warfare and the threat of revolution, communist revolution. The reality, though, was that it kind of held back technological progress and destroyed workers' rights at the same time. So a few corporations benefited from this arrangement, but the Italian economy kind of fell backwards compared to the rest of the world in terms of innovation. And this would have some repercussions in the Second World War with Italian military hardware. We'll get to that in a later lecture. One of the last barriers that Mussolini faced in consolidating his power was in dealing with the Pope. Now, in 1871, prior to the final unification of Italy, the papacy had lost a significant chunk of territory that it ruled in a secular fashion. So the Pope was the leader of the Catholic Church. At the same time, the Pope was also the political ruler of what was known as the Papal States. The Church had never recognized what it considered to be a land grab by the Italian government. And with the Lateran Accords, this kind of put to rest, finally, this dispute between the Vatican and Rome. So the papacy was given sovereignty in Vatican City, that small chunk of territory in Rome. Roman Catholicism became the state religion, the Italian state religion, which really wasn't much for Mussolini to give up since most Italians were Roman Catholics already. The papacy accepted Italian sovereignty over the former papal states, and in exchange, the papacy received payment. Now, this sounds kind of fishy, and many observers at the time were aghast that the Pope would do business with a fascist. Unfortunately for the Church, Mussolini paid in bonds, and the papacy never really profited from the exchange after the fall of the fascist state during the Second World War. Finally, here we have Mussolini seated with the Pope at the signing of the Lateran Treaty. You can notice the positioning of the Pope versus Mussolini. He kind of pushed the Pope off to his right, which would be your left viewing it, and he's propped up a little bit to make him look a little taller. He also, of course, has to be seated because many of the men also at the signing were quite a bit taller than him. And that draws to our conclusion this first portion, or the first examination of the rise of European fascism.